So welcome everyone to today's session on civil wars and the writing of civil wars. This is a very exciting panel, and I'm really glad it coincides actually with the 10th anniversary of the Centre for War Studies. Hard to believe that it's been that long. But I'm delighted to have our three wonderful guest speakers here today, some of whom you will, of course, know. Moving from right to left, of course, we've got Dolan, who's at Trinity College and who has done some remarkably interesting work on the cultural history of the Irish Civil War in particular. So one of the ideas, I should have said that at the beginning, is, of course, to bring people into conversation who have had very distinct approaches towards the history of civil war and restoration, or cultural gender history, as well as a political scientist who we've invited to come along. But of course, Stathis is a very historically minded political scientist. Glenda Gilmore is normally based at Yale, but we're very fortunate to have her here this year as the Mary Ball Washington visiting professor for the entire academic year. Glenda, of course, is an expert on African American history, but also gender history, social history of America. And she's currently teaching here a course on American history in the period of the Civil War and Restoration. Stathis, as I said, Stathis Kalyvas is a political scientist, formerly based at Yale, and since January, he is based at the University of Oxford, where he's the Gladstone Professor of Government. Stathis has written a very influential book on the logic of civil wars, and I think you kind of returned to a topic that has interested you for a long time, the Greek Civil War, and then moving on to more general conceptual work on civil wars. So I'm really excited about bringing you into conversation, and the format that this will take is that each of our speakers will talk for about 15 to max 20 minutes, and then afterwards we open up a more general conversation, and everyone is extremely welcome to ask questions, disagree with our speakers. The more discussion we have, the better. So in that sense, we thought it might make sense to start off with Stathis with some conceptual observations from the perspective of a political scientist.
So thank you very much, Robert. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was here a few years back. Mm-hmm. And so Robert asked me to revisit the theme of my past book on the violence of civil wars. So I'm going to give you a capsule version of the argument, packaged in a bit, perhaps slightly differently from the book. It's very ahistorical, so the idea is to, what I did in the book, try to understand the dynamics of violence in general, even though I use a lot of very specific examples. But right now, I'm engaged in one of the projects I've been working is a history of civil wars, so to speak, analytical in the sense of trying to understand how civil wars have changed over time, and I'm happy to talk about that and how I see, these ideas evolving. So this book was really about violence and how could we explain violence in civil war. So that's a very specific aspect of civil war. And one of the initial motivations was the observation that I kept hearing, not just in Greece but in other places, that civil wars were the worst kinds of wars because they were the most violent wars. And it turns out empirically that's not true. If you look at various dimensions of violence, you have civil wars that are not extremely violent, and you have interstate wars that can be extremely violent. So it doesn't really correspond to reality. However, there is a basis for that perception. It's not an arbitrary perception. In the sense, there's something specific about violence in civil war that makes people, or created in people, the sense that they were exceptional in some respect. And I think there were two features that were captured by that perception. And I call those features, using stark titles, barbarity. That was the first kind of, the idea that somehow violence in civil wars is more atrocious than in other settings. And the second one is the idea of intimacy, that civil war takes place often between people who know each other, who are neighbors, and in a sort of metaphorical way, they are brothers. So the idea of fratricide is very often used as a way to describe this violence, and I call that intimacy. the idea that violence is intimate. Now, if we examine those two ideas, they have several problems. They're not as straightforward as we would like them to be. The first one, the idea of barbarity, is that of excessive violence, of atrocious violence. But if you think about it, what exactly is excessive violence? In fact, excessive or barbaric violence tends to be very culturally specific judgment. And if you think about the way we think today about what makes barbaric violence barbaric, very often it has to do with very close contact, or the use of knives, for example, seems to us to be extremely barbaric, but at the same time, pressing a button and bombing from a very big distance someone else doesn't have the same kind of quality. But these are very culturally embedded kinds of codes, so that cannot really be, in and of itself, the difference. Another way to think about it is the number of victims. And as I said, there is quite a lot of variation. The most common idea that people have, especially in the humanitarian world, is the idea that civil wars somehow produce more victimization of civilian populations, non-combatants. That is, civilians are really targeted much more than in other wars. It's a tricky comparison, also not completely true. And in fact, if you look at an example that has been used as a sort of almost archetypal example of excessive violence in civil war, it's the war in Bosnia. It turns out that the early figure of 200,000 death fatalities was not correct. There is now a data set that recorded all the names of the victims. It's about half, and half of them were not civilians. So even in a very sort of extremely victimizing conflict such as Bosnia, a large proportion of the victims were actually combatants, which tells you that barbarity has to be understood perhaps in a different way. And I think it really is captured by intimacy. And again, a lot of the victims of civil wars very often are unknown to each other. They may die in battlefields, they may die from a variety of other things. But the fact that people who know each other very often engage in violence against each other has a particularly transgressive dimension that I think sticks with people, creates a long-term trauma, and is very difficult to deal with. And I think this is where eventually, ultimately, everything that has to do with this exceptional character of civil war violence comes back to. So what I wanted to do in this project was to make sense, to provide this sort of account of violence that could account for those two dimensions. One way, and people had not really thought in a sort of theoretically autonomous way about violence in civil wars, because most of the thinking about civil wars encompasses every aspect. And so what I did was to try to reconstruct four distinct intellectual traditions that we can see emerging time and again to try to make sense of violence in civil wars. The first one I call Hobbesian tradition. And it's basically the idea that violence is the result of anarchy. And it's very much associated today, for example, with new wars, failed states, the idea that the collapse of state authority opens the door to the true nature of humans, as Hobbes describes it. So that's a very popular version. You find it both among scholars, but also in popular discourse, the idea that anarchy produces violence. The second one I call Schmittian tradition, from Carl Schmitt, the German constitutional scholar, Nazi sympathizer, but also very sharp anti-liberal thinker, who also theorized the idea of polarization, which has come back now because of Trump. And the idea here is that, what is violence in civil wars? It's just the extreme version of enmity, of hostility. When you have true divisions in a society, it's only natural that they're going to be expressed in a violent way. In fact, the Marxist perception is very close to the Schmittian one, the idea that violence is the process through which societies move towards progress. And you could say that a lot of the accounts of ethnic conflict today, in the past of class conflict, are very much based on the idea of polarization. So the idea of ancient hatreds. You have different groups in society, they dislike each other, they hate each other, and therefore, when a civil war happens, they turn against each other. So that's a fundamental idea here. The third tradition may be described as Foucauldian tradition from Michel Foucault, the French thinker, who theorized power. And the idea here is that violence is very often so extreme because there is a particular transgression from attacking power, and therefore the state reacts in a way that's extreme. If you look at a lot of both the descriptions but also the more theoretical treatment, say, of post-September 11 reactions, the return of torture, etc., that embodies very much this idea that what really makes civil wars of violence is the fact that the authority is challenged in a way that is not really permitted, and therefore the reaction has to be exceptional. It's also associated, again, you could say, with Smith and the idea of the state of emergency. And finally, the last tradition I call Clausewitzian tradition, because in a sense it specifies, it posits that violence in civil wars takes its particular features because it's an outgrowth of the military characteristics of the conflict. It's not really about ideology. It's not about the state or the opposition. It's not about anarchy. It's about the military dimension of the conflict. And you can think about the descriptions of guerrilla war as dirty wars very much coming out of that tradition. Now, if you think about all of those four approaches, they all have merits. They all capture a part of reality. And they all have problems. For example, if you think about the Hobbesian tradition, very often what happens in civil wars is not the absence of authority, but the proliferation of authorities. And it's not true to say that societies where the state has collapsed, like Somalia, are ungoverned societies. They're rather governed by other types of actors. In the Schmittian tradition, what's very interesting, I'm going to return to that, is the fact that has been recorded by many students, for example, of ethnic conflict, anthropologists and others, of how the war itself creates polarization, which then a lot of other observers, journalists, etc., then go back and, in a sense, argue was the cause of the conflict in the first place. There's a very interesting debate, for example, about the development of Sunni Shia violence in Iraq and how that was the result of the US invasion, not of the result of ancient hatreds. The Foucauldian tradition also, in a sense, disregards the fact that violence very often comes from non-state actors, not just the state, very much like the Hobbesian version sees the violence as the result of anarchy. And the Clausewitzian version was always very underspecified. People would just mention that there's something about war that leads to these forms of violence, but they would never really trace it. So in my work, I thought, perhaps being a political scientist as well, that I would start from the last one. I would take the Clausewitzian tradition. And in fact, if you look at political science approaches to violence in civil war, they tend to be very much motivated by this last tradition. And there are three versions of that, two bad and one good. The first one is a sort of naive version, which basically posits, and there are a number of works and papers in that direction, that what happens in civil wars is you have two actors. You have the state and the opposition, and they fight, and violence is used to signal capacity, power. So you kill a lot of people to tell the people the state is not able to protect you. Is to send a signal to the state or to the rebels. That's the idea. The second version is a Hobbesian version of the Clausewitzian tradition, which is basically, it's not anarchy in society, but what happens, especially among armed actors in civil wars, is that they are internally fragmented and divided. They cannot enforce discipline. So you have armed actors where basically the commanders unleash their troops, who then gratuitously kill and maim population. So a lot of the work that has been done in that tradition emphasizes, is very much inspired by what happened in places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, etc. So the abductions by children, sexual violence. So it's the result of indiscipline. It's a sort of anarchy within military structures. My approach is more complicated. It's triadic. And so what I argue is that civil wars are places in which you have armed actors competing against each other, but they also need to both acquire the loyalty and threaten the civilian population in order to make sure they only collaborate with them and not with the other side. So it's a bit like a triangle. You have ideally two armed actors and the population, and it's a game that takes place among those three. And I specify in the book a very specific type of institutional environment, guerrilla or irregular war. And what is a distinct assumption about that is that the form and the needs of guerrilla war very often create incentives for the deployment of the violence that we observe in these kinds of situations, and especially coercive violence. The idea of using violence in order to get people to behave in ways you want them to behave. So it's not about extermination, as in genocide, but about controlling people. And there is a sort of, what complicates the picture is that there is a bilateral situation or structure in which individuals can leave one side and go to the other side. I'm going to complete fairly quickly. As a result, what you have in these kinds of situations is informational asymmetries. That is, the sides that fight want to identify who is working for the other side, but they cannot really tell who's working for the other side, and they press civilians to get that information out of them, and that leads to a number of forms of violence, which can be indiscriminate if people are targeted on the basis of some general characteristic, their ethnicity, or it can be selective if people are targeted because some information came out about them. And selective violence is very common, even though it's much less visible, because people get targeted individually, not as large groups, but eventually that adds up to very large numbers. And that's my favorite picture of this type of violence, in which comes from Greece's German occupation in 1944. And you see, in fact, the informer, the figure of the hooded informer who provides this armed man with local information about who is who. So the idea is not to execute everyone, but select those who are deemed to be the most dangerous people. So that's the idea here. And you can see the modern version of that from Iraq, one of the few pictures of selection process by local hooded figures. But it's a very common occurrence in accounts and narratives of many civil wars that take the form of guerrilla war. I'm going to conclude with 4 implications from this account, which I think are worth pursuing and discussing. The first one is that in these kinds of environments, violence is often produced jointly. What do I mean jointly? It's because armed actors need information from civilians. They cannot often act without the assistance of civilians. So violence is a process that connects people with weapons with people with information. And this information is local information. And so that suggests that, unlike what is often argued, in situations of civil wars, civilians often do have agency. And one type of agency they have is the capacity to harm others. This is the intimate part of violence. They don't do it directly, they do it by providing information. That's the common process through which individuals harm people they dislike. And that creates a situation in which also the boundary between perpetrators and victims can be blurred, because very often the victims can become perpetrators. And of course, the perpetrators can be victimized in the course of a conflict. It has a lot of implications about how humanitarian thinking operates, because very often it places a very strong boundary between non-combatants and combatants, civilians who are presumed to be innocent, and fighters who are presumed to be guilty. In fact, I argue the boundary is very blurred, and that has a lot of normative implications as well. The second implication is that violence in civil wars is often privatized, in the sense that the process of providing information opens the door to what is known as moral hazard. People use the opportunity to denounce others in order to settle local and personal accounts, which is a lot of what we read in ethnographic descriptions or micro-historical descriptions of civil wars, how civil wars in a sense become a war of all against all, but in the very localized sense of people who have grudges against each other using that opportunity. And in that sense, you could say that civil war violence is not an instance of polarization, but of privatization of violence. Exactly the opposite than someone like Schmidt would believe. And it's the flip side of ideological polarization, and also the dark side of social capital. Why? Because places that have a lot of interaction between people are going to be the places in which people also dislike each other very much and use the opportunity to go against each other. So small villages, for example, tend to be worse places. In the Soviet Union, during the Stalinist era, a lot of denunciations came from people who lived in communal apartments because they just hated each other living in a small space. The third implication is that one of the things that always struck me when I was studying these issues, to the extent to which what was going on the ground often did not fit with the issues that were composing what we may describe as the master cleavage. So you may have a war between, say, leftists and rightists, or Serbs and Croats, but in fact, very often the violence on the ground seemed to follow the boundaries of families, of clans, of competing villages, and that was always very, very puzzling. And people have a very hard time understanding that. And there is always a tendency to impute to every micro-action motivations that come from the master cleavage, and in a sense, mislead us. But by the same account, what we observe is when a war continues, violence itself creates identities in a sort of endogenous ways. It transforms how people think of themselves. So you could argue that in Iraq, the Sunni-Shia dimension didn't have a violent or a very intense kind of division. A lot of the killing was very personalistic. But as a result of what went on, new identities emerged that were, in a sense, infused with the legacy of violence. And there is quite a lot of work in political science now trying to trace the legacies of violence over time and how they shape identities, how they shape, for example, voting behavior. And in Ireland, of course, that's something that is quite easy to make sense. So these are the four implications, and I think they constitute the basis for a fruitful discussion. I would argue that even though they take different forms in different civil wars, you can observe those patterns in many different civil wars across time and space.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Stathis. Thanks for the concise summary of your key arguments. I'm sure once we put them to the empirical test, there will be questions. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start with Glenda, I think. We're going to do this chronologically. Although I understand there are also people working on very different time periods and civil wars. So I'm sure there will be questions from the audience later on as well. But I think we move on and you start and then we...
Thank you. I found this incredibly interesting, and also reading David Armitage's book, which looks at civil wars from Rome onward. So just to respond to sort of put out a groundwork that we can discuss later before I turn to what I wanted to say today, the American Civil War is very different in many ways from that sort of neighbor to neighbor, very local, clan, etc. group that we just heard about. There are ways in which it's similar, and I think it's really productive to think about that. It's a more traditional war than those that we've just heard described. It is such a stark geographical division that the only place that you have that sort of neighbor-to-neighbor conflict is on the border states. And we also have a war within a war in the United States, a guerrilla war in the border states, Jesse James, et cetera, and also in areas that weren't plantation states. The American Civil War is so costly that on one day at the Battle of Shiloh, more people died, more Americans died than in the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War. So the carnage leading into barbarity is astounding, and it astounds people at the time. They never expected this. They saw more of a smaller kind of engagement. Generally, people have argued that the American Civil War is not a total war. Yet the equivalent today of America's population, 7.9 million people would have died, given the population then. And one of the reasons people are beginning to think that we see the Civil War as not barbarous is the way that the Union kept records. It's always been thought of as a low rape war, yet they had another word for rape in the official records, which was pillaging. And it's completely obfuscated what's actually going on. I don't think it was anywhere near a scale of barbarity, except on maybe a Clausewitzian sort of scale, which is a more mechanized killing machine. They had no idea what was in their hands. They had no idea of the outcome. So, a task this evening is to discuss why we write about the Civil War, what writing about the Civil War is like, which I will do, but I'll start with a caveat. For most white Southerners of a certain age in the United States, it's difficult to speak of writing about the Civil War without talking about living the Civil War, coming to terms with how the American Civil War shaped our lives. Even for me, born some 86 odd years after the end of the Civil War, it molded my identity and politics until I was 20. I stood up every time the band played Dixie. Indeed, I was required to. It was played after the national anthem at every event, whether a concert or a sporting event or a political rally. My family taught me never to say, quote, the Civil War, instead, the war between the states. And there are many more pejorative terms than that. A framed poster on the wall of the 53rd Confederate Regiment, Company F, showed my ancestors' names who fought at Gettysburg. They were captured and reported back that the Yankees were actually very nice to them. Of course, I was taught that the Civil War was never about slavery. It was about states' rights. I once was at a wedding sharing a table with a friend of Strom Thurmond's, who's a South Carolina senator, and the man's name I was sharing the table with was States' Rights Graham. So this goes deep. White people in the American South during the century following the Civil War had dual alliances, one to the nation, but perhaps even more fervently to the South, even to the Confederacy itself. C. Vann Woodward, a white Southerner and a historian of the South, put it this way in his book, The Burden of Southern History. Quote, to establish identity with reference to our faults was always the simplest for the Northerners. For whatever their reservations about our virtues, our critics were never reluctant to concede to us our vices and shortcomings. White Southerners had tremendous inferiority complexes, which they attempted to overcome by embracing something that they called Southern heritage. White Southerners were losers in a nation of winners. They were seen as racists on the wrong side of history, still suffering economic deprivation until the late 1950s. They were poor in a nation of plenty. Even worse, they were actually traitors to their own country. So immediately after the war, despite the fact that they were no longer a nation, they set about creating one of the most powerful and long-lasting national myths ever promulgated, despite a plethora of evidence that white Southerners had embraced an ever more virulent pro-slavery ideology from 1830 to 1860, despite the fact that they had tried to extend slavery to the Western territories and take over the entire nation, despite the fact that they had fomented an insurrection against the country, they rewrote history and set to work creating a culture that glorified their cause. In this new iteration, they were benevolent people who had been stuck with caring for an enslaved race, and they only wanted to be left alone to sort out that problem. Any ongoing interference after the war with what they then called the, quote, Negro problem was misguided, even seditious. Northerners, on the other hand, had threatened to free their enslaved people, and they violated the United States Constitution by not allowing the Southern states to exit the compact. The United States, my teachers always said, was a republic. It was not a democracy. For over a century, this was what was taught in public schools in the South, what was memorialized in town squares, and what became Southern heritage. A glorious lost cause had caused a rift between brothers, North and South, now resolved, and we must honor both sides. The losing side in the American Civil War triumphed in national memory. Perhaps the most famous and popular Civil War historian in the 1950s, Bruce Caton, wrote, "The lost cause ideology has been an asset to the entire country. The Confederate legend saved us." He might have more accurately said the Confederate legend saved only white America for white Americans. The truth and task of reconciliation was simply too monstrous for white people to live with. Confederates became rebels with a noble cause, not traitors. The psychological burden of living with the horror that the Confederacy had wrought on the entire nation was simply too great to be reckoned with. It had to be rewritten and embraced. The Confederate flag flew over the South Carolina state capitol until 2015, and it is still ubiquitous across the South. Every other high school called its team the Rebels. However, lost cause mythology, of course, did real political work. It could only have triumphed because white people across the country wrote African Americans out of the story. It provided protective cover for a century of systemic discrimination, disenfranchisement, economic persecution, and violence against black Southerners. In this long tale, the aftermath of the American Civil War, it was that ultimately enraged me, allowed me to remain seated for Dixie, and made me a historian. With the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 60s, that myth fell apart. A generation of white Southerners suddenly faced a century of lies that they had been told, lies in the family, lies on the street, in the courts, and in the archives, and began writing truer histories of slavery, the Civil War, and its aftermath, which in the United States we call Reconstruction. As I began to write about formerly enslaved people who lived through that period, I understood for the first time the power of history to erase truth in the service of a flawed national agenda. The shock of leaving the cult of the lost cause, of having been betrayed in the most fundamental ways about who I was and where I lived and what it stood for, has been a powerful engine for my scholarship. What can the American Civil War teach us about civil wars more generally? I learned a lot just then, and I deeply admire David Armitage's Search in Civil Wars, A History in Ideas, as a guide to probe and analyze the phenomenon over place and time. His definition of a civil war is, quote, a war between citizens. And it's useful in the American case, particularly because it was a war among citizens in which there was also a large group of non-citizens, African Americans, free and enslaved. Armitage is concerned with providing a frame that will enable us to structure governments, perhaps to prevent civil wars, to understand how they arise, perhaps with the possibility of stopping them, and to draw lessons that can be put into place to prevent them. When we think about generalizing the American Civil War, I would suggest there are at least three fruitful areas of inquiry. First, and this is a concern, no doubt, driven by America's current political crisis, it seems to me that the construction of the Constitution contributed to the rise of the Confederacy. At a time today when in the U.S. the founders' intentions are venerated and constitutional originalism will be guiding our legal decisions for decades to come, it is important for us to recognize the Constitution as a flawed document. The founders, people who had led their own revolution against another government, feared centralized power and faced making an alliance with Southern colonies, whose foremost concern was to protect the institution of slavery. The result was a document that espoused liberty, but compromised it at every turn. The Three-Fifths Compromise. The South wanted to be counted in population with its slaves, but of course slaves were not citizens, so they compromised and said, okay, we'll count them as 3/5 of a person. The Senate, which has 2 members from every state, regardless of population, and the Electoral College, which just second-guessed the will of the American majority as a whole. The result is a document written to be loose enough to contain fracture between the states. One might think that looseness could contain faction, but pro-slavery Southerners used this looseness to reinterpret law to their advantage at every turn, especially to extend slavery into the territories, eventually leading to rebellion. Indeed, the United States might be a republic, not a democracy, if recent history is any rule. Today, we are reaping the whirlwind of a right-wing force intent on getting their way by manipulating the looseness of that republicanism to their advantage. Second, in thinking about civil wars, at least in the American case, aftermath is everything. Geographical, economic, racial, and ethnic divisions that give rise to the war are often unsettled, even exacerbated in its aftermath. It is exceptionally difficult in a civil war to occupy the losing region, reconstruct its government, restructure its society, and ultimately bind it to the nation against which it rebelled, which is the cause, the purpose that won in the aftermath. Armitage uses the metaphor of illness and disease to describe a civil war. I would suggest that curing the disease only begins when the war ends. Historians and political scientists can profit from comparing processes of national reconstructions. In the case of the United States, Reconstruction failed spectacularly. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s even named itself the Second Reconstruction, an attempt to make right the cost of the Civil War by making African Americans full citizens. Finally, since the illness of civil war is not cured with war, the work of preventing civil war falls on historians. Its illness lingers, sometimes in remission, in ways that history and culture mythologize the war. The hegemony of the myth of the lost cause was for decades promoted by historians and allowed the divisions of the Civil War to fester for a century, even to this day. It enabled the white South to move rapidly from enslavement to debt peonage, carceral control of black Southerners, extra-legal violence against African Americans. It literally taught generations of white Southerners to be racist. And now it threatens once more to divide the United States. The rise of our far right there is virulent, and it is a far right that embraces and even expands lost cause myths. When a deranged white boy spouting those myths about African Americans, quote, raping our women, can massacre black church ladies in Charleston, or when the President of the United States can say of a violent white supremacist rally designed to save Confederate statues in Charlottesville, Virginia, that there were, quote, good people on both sides, my country is in mortal danger. Victims of a century and a half of miseducation about the Civil War, Americans are ill-equipped to deal with the crisis at hand. This suggests that there is constructive work for historians to do in the wake of Civil War. Certainly we should be heartened by structures for healing and learning, such as Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in war's aftermath. But even they cannot withstand the subsequent onslaught of rewriting history and reshaping culture that occurs for decades after Civil War. In truth, civil wars go on even for centuries after they end. It's up to historians and political scientists to fight the myth-making that distorts the record, even when that myth-making is put to the task of national healing. If we do not enter the public debate, exert influence on the school curricula, and engage in the cultural sphere to dispel those myths, they triumph. And other nations will find themselves, as the United States does now, fighting the same civil war over and over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Glenda, and of course, it won't surprise you that I agree that the aftermaths of war matter. With that, I'll hand over to Anne.
You might find I agree as well. I suppose this is moving to a very different example, and in some ways maybe hope to explain why small matters. I suppose to address Robert's question that he set us, I opted to work on civil war because it takes much of what's interesting about war and intensifies it, from mobilisation, when the decision to fight might march you out to face an enemy from the next parish, the next farm, the next field, to the type and quality of violence, on into the living with it after, when parish, farm and field have to work out some means to function, albeit never get along. I opted for civil war because there's less of the stench of heroism about it, because it leaves something harder to rectify, and rectify at the most mundane levels of existence. P.S. O'Hegarty summed up his disillusionment with the Irish Civil War in 1924. For him, it banished, as he put it, our deep-rooted belief that there was something in us finer than, more spiritual than anything in any other people, that we were really an uncivilised people with savage instincts, and the shock of the plunge from the heights to the depths staggers the whole nation. I opted for civil war perhaps because I find disillusionment more interesting than triumphalism, but maybe more I opted for anything that encouraged the type of uncertainty O'Hegarty here laments. I opted for civil war because most of what I learned about it didn't make a huge amount of sense. I was told that it was central to Irish political life, that it explained its fundamental divisions, but also that it was the thing that went most avoided, most unmentioned, that it was the place where veterans' memoirs stumbled and stalled and went awkwardly quiet. I opted for civil war because even after the most cursory glances, I found that that was absolute rot. There was plenty of people talking about it, writing about it, raging and indifferent about it. That whatever reticence there was, it was the reticence of later generations imposing, for all sorts of reasons, their own reservations, their own sense that silence was and always had been the most appropriate response. I still opt for civil war because it's at once the most overplayed and at the same time the most underestimated dimension of our recent history, and the concerns that seems to be brewing over how we might best acknowledge its 100th anniversary might do well to reflect with calm perspective rather than panicked circumspection. Better known for his short stories, Frank O'Connor could write without comment that he took up lodgings in the house of an ex-Free State Army officer some mere months after his release from a Free State prison in 1923. While the rent he paid may well have tempered the passions for political division in that house, that he could live there at all, never mind right of it, with such a sense of normalcy, nay indifference, should certainly give us pause for thought. There were far more to both lodger and landlord than has so far been within our ken. I looked at civil war initially through the prism of commemoration, so in many respects, I've always been interested in aftermaths as much as in civil war itself. How places do or don't put themselves back together, for me, is as important as the breach in the first place, but I'm conscious that this type of navel gazing is as tedious for you as it is embarrassing for me, so I'd prefer to show you something of what I mean. I'm going to take you to a back road in a small place in 1928. I want you to pull your chairs up to eavesdrop on a row about turf, missing, maybe stolen, taken turf. I want you to overhear the insults thrown, imagine the war of words that ended up in Cavan Circuit Court, where a man called Philip Smith was ordered to pay £10 damages for calling Lucy Galligan's virtue into disrepute. Whether Lucy Galligan was as chaste or faithful as Philip Smith thought she ought to have been, we may never know or need to care. But in the course of unpicking the case, the court heard some of what passed for insults in that small place in 1928. As far as Smith saw it, Mrs. Galligan's husband, as he said, ought to be shot for thatching Sarahan's roof. He needed no elaboration or explanation for this to hit home. Lucy Galligan, no less than all the busybodies at the back of the court, knew exactly what he meant by that. The Sarahans were James and his wife Mary Ann, and both were murdered under that same thatched roof 5 years before. In December 1923, more than 6 months after the end of the Civil War, two men forced their way in and murdered husband and wife. At the time, the newspapers called their deaths the most atrocious murder ever committed in this country, which was quite a claim given the share of violence the newspapers had described in the months and years before. Admittedly, Cavan had not known the kinds of violence other counties knew, and maybe murder of any kind was shocking, when for close on 7 months now what looked like war was supposed to have given way to what passed for peace. Maybe that alone was enough to prompt such headlines. But maybe it was because the Sarahan's 7-month-old daughter was found, as one newspaper put it, sleeping with its little nightdress saturated in her mother's blood. Maybe it was just the awful vividness of such a stain on such a little dress. Maybe it merited the phrase most atrocious because Mary Ann Saran had been shot in the face because she was over 4 months pregnant carrying a son, as her post-mortem found out. Maybe it was just because the idea of men coming to the door in the darkness, forcing their way in, was all supposed to be done and gone by the end of 1923. Hadn't that at least finished? That same newspapers that called this atrocious were also very quick to say the crime has no political significance. And maybe it hasn't in the usual obvious sense. The Sarahans arguably died because of land, because of 8 acres, 2 cattle and 4 pigs to be precise. They died over a very local row. And the row went on. No one would buy hay or oats from the farm the following year. Sarahan's brother preferred to face court in 1925 rather than deal with his dead brother's debts, too afraid to tend the farm or to use what little money Sarahan had left him. Nearly 5 years after these murders, the charge of thatching their roof was as bad as slut or whore or whatever aspersion Philip Smith could think to cast on a married woman's virtue during a squabble on the side of the road. It was still part of the winning and the losing of a small local row, still part of the cruel banter of the back roads that said Cavan had no intention of burying its hatreds with its dead. This is just a small example and wasn't hard to find, and while it is not, as the newspapers said, arguably about civil war, as we may usually define it, it is not untouched or unshaped by it either. What brought a big British bulldog revolver, as it was described by the journalists, to the bottom end of Cavan in December 1923? What made and shaped the men who now knew how to use it, who now knew how to kill in that way, and who still thought killing like that was the way to settle old scores months after civil war was done? I'm not suggesting that we craft a history of civil war that dredges up every fought-over field, every overwrought local passion, that loses itself in the hatreds of small places where slights and sins are known seed, breed and generation. Don't worry, Homer's ghost is not whispering here as he did to Patrick Kavanagh. I only want to muddy the waters, not craft an Iliad from such a local row. I'm interested in civil war because, if nothing else, the Sarahans and their killers show us up something of our undue neat and tidiness when it comes to this and other types of conflict. They show how readily we've settled for obvious subjects and chronologies, how quick we've been to accept when one war ends and another begins, because a traditional or dominant political narrative has always said it was so. The Sarahans and their killers did not keep time to our rather straightforward tune. Dividing the period up easily, rising, War of Independence, Civil War, never mind that this is all a deeply 26-county type of division at that, or that any and all of these terms are contested yet, makes less and less sense as we begin to ask different types of questions of the records, and particularly of the violence we might find there. There remains a quality to the violence described above that reaches right across the period of revolution here for shorthand, that mocks the easy periodisation we seem keen for convenience sake to settle for. Before 1919 and after 1923, the records let us see how violence works, what it asks of those who fight, of those who watch, of those who pass quietly by, whatever the year, whatever we call the war. And the more we ask of the records, the more the distinctions blur. Irishmen killed Irish men, and to a lesser extent women, right through and beyond it all. The violence reveals maybe many civil wars that bleed beyond the margins we've largely drawn, just so we can set our wars apart and classify them all neat and tidily away. For those who fled and those who were fled from, there was none of the clarity about where one war ended and another began. I'm interested in civil war because it makes it very hard to be neat and tidy about very much at all, which is important because I think we have our upcoming anniversaries, and they've tended to leave us searching for quite straightforward, easy narratives in the past. And with the centenary coming, it almost behoves us to interrogate the aftermath of civil war here all the more. How long did the divisions last? What forms did they take? And which do we choose to recognise? How do they continue to express themselves? How do they cling on so that another next generation knew exactly which old sore to prod so that prodding hurt? Who decided when and if division got to stop? So in a way, my squabble on the back roads of Cavan comes to matter as much as civil war itself, because we can begin to gauge something of how all that period did or did not thrive in that one small place. We can begin to see the tangle of it all, how all the politics and the violence of those years meshed with and became knitted into hatreds that may well have long predated them, hatreds and slights that then shaped them, that added who you voted for, which side you willingly or unwillingly took, who you helped, befriended or turned your back on, to your list of old unforgiven sins, that just became another means to hold you to the same old account. Of course, this period gave plenty of cause for new divisions and divides, but we would be foolish to pass up on the rich tapestries of spite that patch our landscape both after, during and before. How division hangs on says something of its depth, something of what it started as. What it once was tells us at least how people chose to fathom the nature of it all. If we slip too readily into a world slip plainly pro and anti-treatyite, we are left with only a neat and tidy understanding of this divide. We make something drab and lesser of what might be much more challenging and interesting terrain. We've been intense in our scrutiny of how violence started, operated and stopped, but we've been less assiduous here, I think, about the times between, when those same groups with such seemingly deep divides could somehow rub along together cheek by jowl, could put themselves back together enough to get by. And in ways that is what I want to get at here, because I think it might shed some light on the nature of the divisions themselves and ask questions of actually how deep they went. The Sarahan's death, partly because of all the brutal detail to be found, give us a glimpse, I think, in an Irish context of what might have been as much as what was. What is most striking about the years that followed the Irish Civil War is how relatively quickly law and order was re-established and how relatively few Sarahans there were. Do we find that instead of being ruled and ruined by our divisions, we actually dealt with them relatively well? That given the conditions, there could have been more deaths, more spite, more sectarianism, more avarice, more greed, and you can pick whatever word you want. Police reports, for example, reflect the hunger for land, the sense that violence was to be feared from all sorts of sources here. But it's also clear by late 1924 and into 1925 that most of what was feared never came to fruition. Our massacres are measured in remarkably small numbers, and we probably shouldn't lose sight of that. I'm interested in the Irish Civil War because this is where it really has something important to say to other contemporary conflicts. How and why could it be so contained here when so many other new states at the same time tore themselves much more violently apart? If we follow on from Bill Kazan's choice of the Finnish Civil War as an appropriate contemporary comparator, a war with approximately 36,000 dead in less than 6 months, compared to Ireland's, at its lowest estimates, around about 1,500, even if you take the highest estimate I've found of about 5,000 dead. We can also see just how dramatic the differences continued to be after both civil wars' ends. In the 1920s and 30s, they were the most violent in Finnish history if measured by the rates of homicide, with homicide rates almost double in the 20s what they'd been before the First World War. In the Irish Free State, by contrast, homicide rates went into a significantly sharp decline. Annual reports counted 1,052 in 1921, but only 24 by 1925, 16 by 1932, 5 of which were cases of infanticide. It may well be an extreme measure, but it is one which we should dwell on when tempted, particularly going towards the centenary of all this, to give in to our Angela's Ashes instincts that worse than the ordinary miserable Civil War is the miserable Irish Civil War. V.S. Pritchard came here as a poorly paid journalist to explain to his readers the nature of civil war. Finding Dublin dull in early 1923, he followed the Civil War south, and while the sounds of shots told him danger wasn't far away, it didn't stop him going to the theatre, where Doran's touring company were playing a different Shakespearean tragedy to packed houses every night. His first sight of Macbeth and Hamlet and Othello were shared with the commercial travellers who stayed with him in the same hotel. He remembered Shakespeare in Kerry voices shortening the road back to his hotel bed. Called home by his editor, his explanation for his departure should make us think. By the end of 1923, Ireland, he writes, which had attracted the newspapers of the world since 1916, had ceased to be interesting. No one wanted to read about Ireland anymore, and so he left because there was a coup to chase in Spain instead. Unlike many of the other new states to emerge at this time, this place did survive. It had probably some of the most stable 1920s and 30s in Europe, and it avoided the excesses of political extremes when much of Europe began to march to the rhythms of a fascist or a communist jackboot. Stability was a valuable commodity in interwar Europe, however much it seemed to look like stasis for Ireland after 1945. What is interesting is how, despite civil war, the Free State seems to manage that. None of this is meant to play down the serious nature of the Civil War here or to be callous about the lives it took or the more it may have ruined in many other ways. But I'm interested in civil war because we need to question how all-consuming we seem to need it to be, both at the time and since. Of course the Civil War mattered. It remained a handy register of abuse for decades, but we take too readily, I think, for granted that politics in this state, indeed the state itself, was bound to be, as one historian writes, disfigured by the hatreds, betrayals and disillusionment of civil war. In the 1920s and 30s, as we're now seeing, because of the release of the military service pension applications, both sides requested supporting references from old Civil War enemies, but it seems to have taken the historiography longer to get over the divide. Rather than simply understanding the intensity of Civil War divisions, I think we should be much more interested in what put this place back together again. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vann. What I found fascinating about this is that just as I have sort of geared myself up to thinking that civil wars are the kind of one of the great overlooked keys to the 20th century, all three of you sort of played down their relevance, which I thought was fascinating, because Stathis, of course, by citing some statistics, started off by saying that civil wars are better than their reputation. Not as bad as their reputation. And Glenda was saying, well, you really have to look at the aftermaths are actually might be more decisive than the actual fighting during civil wars, which is something that, of course, Anne also emphasized. And you got to a point which I'm really interested in personally, and I will open the floor in a minute. I'm just capitalizing on the fact that I'm chairing this discussion. How do we write a comparative history of civil wars? Which I think, Anne, towards the end of your talk, you were moving into that direction and saying that comparative history helps us to question some certainties that we have held for a long time, both about scale, about causes, about causations, etc., etc. But how can you do that in a structured way? Because I think, Glenda, at some point, you started off with the observation that the American Civil War is different. But of course, you can say that about most conflicts in human history. But is there a level playing field? Is there something where we can say, look, for a structural comparison, these are the parameters that we need to look at? And that kind of goes back to where Stathis started from. One of the concepts that I've been thinking about is also intimacy, which I find quite intriguing. Whether it actually gets us anywhere is another one, but I find it interesting as a question. Is intimacy what radicalizes these particular forms of conflict, or does it not matter at all? Do you have any views?
Many. We touched on a variety of issues, and one of the things that I think this parallel reading of Civil Wars illustrates is how you can move from the very small scale to the very large scale, from the micro to the global, and still be in the same phenomenon. And those things constitute pieces of the same puzzle that we have to recognize are separate, but at the same time connected. It is possible, and in fact, we can say a lot of different things. I could say, for example, that a lot of civil wars are not called civil wars when they create states. So we call the Irish Civil War only the second part of, in fact, what was the Civil War from the get-go. We don't call the American War of Independence a civil war, even though it was one. And there is a lot to be said about the aftermath of the losers of that conflict, of the Tories, and to discuss the nature of Canada, which in fact is the nation state that represents those who did not secede. So there is a lot to be said, and there are many angles one can pick when comparing. Very often people, and I find historians, for example, concerned about comparisons because they believe that it's a way to disregard specificities. But at the same time, and I'm very critical of many political scientists who are very often naive in their comparisons and sort of compress everything into a mush of undifferentiated facts. But I think there is a middle ground where we can take advantage of these very rich differences and actually compare them to both prompt. What is always amazing is how similar debates are in different contexts that never cross each other, and how easy. I always joke and I say the fundamental text about civil wars is the description by Thucydides of the Stathis in Corcyra. And if you take away the proper names and you put names from every different other conflict, it becomes very credible as a description of every other conflict, and just do the test. So I think comparison is a tool for bringing a lot of these issues together, and at the same time there's a lot of room for stories of single civil wars that can be both inspired and at the same time feed into those comparative accounts. Mm-hmm. So I don't see that as a clash. I see it, on the contrary, as a process that can contribute to cross-pollination.
Mm-hmm. The only question there, just to quickly intervene before I forget, when you say comparisons, are you talking about 2 or 3 case studies, or are you talking a global comparison? Because, of course, global history can also always mean the history of nowhere.
The scale can vary a lot, and you can also compare. Say, histories of localities within civil wars with each other, which is not a comparison of civil wars. So, always the comparison is a function of the question one asks.
So, this is so interesting to me because I'm suddenly just awash in how the American Civil War isn't like other civil wars. It's helpful to do comparisons about what it's like. It's also helpful to look at categories where things don't fit. And one of the main one of the main criteria that the American Civil War doesn't fit is it's more like a war of nation against nation because the fighting is not on civilian ground in the North except for 2 battles, Antietam and Gettysburg, the ones that are never forgotten. And so the fighting is all on the southern side, which leads to occupation, which is a very different force strategy, political structure than just sort of sorting out differences when people are together. You can't occupy the land. Major armies, much more so than guerrilla warfare, but still some guerrilla warfare. But also I think the most interesting thing is, in many ways, the fact that they're African Americans who then become citizens after the Civil War, that's a huge bulk of population. They're being fought over. And one thing that American history has done in the past 10 years is forge a new historiography of the Civil War, not to talk about whether the North or the South won or who freed the slaves, but to talk about how the slaves freed the slaves, how they moved during wartime. Because as the South lost territory, fugitive slaves ran, and immediately, after a lot of rigmarole, were considered free within Northern Territory. 170,000 African Americans and 150,000 formerly enslaved people fought in the Civil War. So I'm really interested in thinking about comparisons where there's a significant group in a Civil War that isn't empowered to fight that war, I think would be the best way to put it. On the other hand, I wouldn't be thinking all of these things if I hadn't been thinking and hadn't just read Armitage's book about comparisons. So, more confusion for me.
Equally confused. I mean, I suppose it depends. I suppose, as has been said already, what you want the purpose of the comparison to actually be. And I mean, it's quite striking. If, a number of years ago, Peter Hart put forward 10 questions say Irish historians needed to ask about this period, and one included why was the Irish Revolution so violent? I would come to the conclusion, why was it actually relatively peaceful when you look at it in the context of other places? And in some ways, it depends on the scale and the questions you ask, because it's about things like the relationship to democratic processes before the violence breaks out. Numbers games about fatalities become in some ways very risky as well. Not least because, and I think this is one of the sort of dangers, particularly when you're in a smallish example like this one, the Irish one, is that, and again, it's back to your point about the role historians have played over a long time in terms of how they've presented a lot of this material. That sometimes particularly when you start to question the Irish case, and it's back to that slightly flippant remark I made about the Angela's Ashes view of the Irish Revolution, some people feel that if to question that and to actually say this is a relatively small set of conflict, that really in some way you're denigrating something that they have a huge amount invested in. So comparison can be very threatening.
Peter Hart had a very negative experience with all that.
So I think it does to some degree depends on what are we trying to get from it. Do you just want to fit it in with if you like we're really like Finland in one way, but actually we're not like Finland at all in many other respects. So it does depend on the questions, and the questions shift the more I think material that we've come across. But I'm confused about comparison. Sorry.
Okay, at this point I'm opening it up to the floor, and everyone can throw questions at us, and particularly the panelists. I'm just here to moderate.
Making an
There's an interesting juxtaposition. If you think about the Russian Civil War, it causes a very big migration of the losers, the white Russians, but that doesn't somehow reduce the violence back home under the new regime. On the contrary, and when you look comparatively, you can find examples of everything. And so the question again is, what do you use them for? Very often they force you to think. It's very interesting. You're absolutely right to say the American Civil War was a conventional war. It was a war with set battles, with regular armies. But then we have these wonderful studies of the Civil War in the margins, the study of Missouri, for example. And there you see the other world of neighbor against neighbor. You see this dirty, backstabbing kind of environment. So the real puzzle about the American Civil War is not that it's conventional, because many civil wars are conventional. The puzzle is why it didn't spill over very much towards civilian populations. In that respect, the American Civil War is remarkably similar to a non-civil war, to the First World War, which takes primarily place on the battlefield, which is a butchery for the combatants, but leaves, relatively speaking, non-combatants on safer ground, in spite of certain exceptions. So there are a number of very interesting comparisons suggesting themselves, and I don't think there are easy answers to that. But by comparing, one is forced to see where exactly the specificity may lie.
Let me just say one quick thing, that the policy, Lincoln's policy, the War Department's policy, is very much designed all the way through to keep things spilling over into the civilian, keeping them from spilling over into the civilian population. And that is in part why Sherman's March, which is the first time they actually confiscated things from the Confederates' families. They had spent the whole war going through the South and not taking their wheat, not taking their pigs. And so Sherman begins to march to the sea. He says this is total war. And the South is outraged to this day that they could be treated like that. In part, that's because of Lincoln's vision to be sure that the country is reunited after the war, whenever that may be, that they have not been brutalized.
There is a very interesting counterfactual argument, which is very difficult to evaluate in a sort of rigorous way, but the argument is that you have a settler society in which there is a hierarchy of who sits at the top and who sits at the bottom. It's not just the blacks, it's the Native Americans who have been the targets of very extreme forms of violence, and vice versa. We have this other form of lower civil war between settlers and natives. And perhaps the argument is that there is a tradition that between us we don't do these things because we, in a sense, belong to the same kind of hierarchy. This could be an argument to be used.
I believe that that's what they thought. However, the Confederacy tossed all of that overboard when they said that any black Union soldier captured would be executed. And there was a huge massacre at Fort Pillow, which really outraged the North and set them about fighting.
I think that leads us to a very important question. I mean, how do we define civil wars? Is it a sort of self-definition, which some people might say it's, as David would have argued, between citizens, or people who perceive the others as fellow citizens? Or is it between simply violence between different groups who happen to live in a certain place at the same time? I think that matters for the quality of the violence and the degree to which we're talking about transgressive violence. Because if you accept your opponent as a fellow citizen, then the transgression is even worse, of course.
But perhaps that's how a lot of conflicts start. You accept the other as a fellow citizen, and the idea of escalation is precisely, and radicalization is that your identity, your very identity changes. When the insurgency in Iraq started against the US, both Sunni and Shia thought of themselves as Iraqi citizens, but then in a very quick time they started attacking each other.
Mm-hmm. What about the case that you mentioned in your image, actually? It's quite central, so the Greek Civil War overlapping with a larger conflict and kind of both fueling each other. To what extent is that informer also characteristic of other forms of anti-partisan warfare, which I find quite difficult to characterize as civil war? So, say the Germans go into Ukraine. In order to identify non-Orthodox Jews, they have to rely on precisely that informer to tell them where the Jews live, right? If they're Christian, if they're secular Jews, then they're not distinguishable. So that's a different kind of violence, I think, where the role of the informer is also quite crucial.
There are two dimensions to civil wars. One is the civil dimension, which refers to the nature of the cleavage, of the divide, to the politics, and that points primarily to some sort of violent separation. And I think the best intuitive understanding of civil war is not that it concerns citizens, but it concerns entities, polities that are united when the conflict begins. And I think the worst thing one can do is define conflicts by their outcome, rather than by the dynamics that obtain when the conflict begins. And the second dimension is it has to be a war. And so there's lots of violence that often happens that never escalates to the level of war. War requires organization, requires militarization. So you have a lot of forms of violence that are insidious and terrible, but do not become wars. So a civil war has to be a war. There has to be military organization of some sort. Political scientists have all kinds of conventional indicators to deal with that. Sometimes they're not very good. But I think the intuitions are interesting to reflect on. It varies tremendously, but just to give you some data, after the end of the Cold War, the model form of civil war termination has been the negotiated settlement, which by definition allows both sides to participate in the politics of the post-conflict. Whereas a situation in which one side was won a big victory over the other side is characteristic of prior conflicts. The American Civil War is exceptional, quite exceptional in that respect, in that we have a decisive military victory, and yet, as you say, the elites are not purged.
And we also had, the last year and a half of the war, it was clear that it would have to be, the South would have to surrender unconditionally. There would be no negotiated settlement, which had an effect.
But you see how strangely we think about that. Often, especially when it comes to interstate wars, we believe that a good way to end conflicts is to be generous. Because if you repress, you create resentment, you create revanchism. Whereas your argument here was that the American Civil War was bad because there was no repression. There was no punishment.
I know, and I realized that was my argument, but I thought I might not articulate that out loud. But I say that because the settlement did not include over a third of the population in the South who were enslaved people and free black people. I mean, how can you have a settlement without how could you have a negotiated settlement when slavery is the cause of the Civil War without having the slaves?
By definition, negotiated settlements always entail compromises. No side gets its full preferences.
Carthage. So Will, I think, was first.
I'm just interested in, I suppose, maybe I start with living in Kerry and nobody talking about it. And I think
I mean, there's complaints that, I think it's John Waters had it in his I can't remember the book, was it Jiving at the Crossroads, in the sense of how do you explain the differences between in Irish politics other than explain them that, there's civil war politics, or alternatively that one side, Fine Gael drink coffee and Fianna Fáil drink tea, this sort of thing. And in a way that it's this easy shorthand to explain division that we otherwise struggle to identify in Irish political life. And I think in many ways that does a disservice to the type of bread and butter political divisions that are actually there and very clearly there very, very quickly after all of this. And I think, oddly, De Valera is one of the first to actually see how important this is to get inside the political system, because bread and butter politics is going to take over. And he's saying that in 1923. So I think we cannot downplay that and equally overplay. And it's back to your point about the use of history and all this, playing up, in a way, how important this was. Because if your grandmother possibly wasn't, if Stephen Fuller hadn't happened, she may well have been telling you something about the land war. And I think in some ways we need to think about this a little bit in terms of, I don't know, possibly the wrong way of looking at it, but I'm struck by a need here to look at longitudinal examples of violence in different parts of the country, because some of the places that are very violent, that, you know, examined a PhD on the land war, these are places I'm finding are very violent again through some of these later, but like there's to some degree, are there patterns or not? And we're not actually looking at this deeply enough, and how much of this become, it's just another thing to add to folklore. And I'm not suggesting that sounds as dismissive as it is, but I think the one thing it does reinforce is that people are talking about it in different registers, as you say, but they're talking about it a hell of a lot, which is certainly one of the things, and maybe it had a lot to do with the time I started studying history in these corridors. You were told these things were not talked about at all, but they were talked about a hell of a lot for all sorts of reasons, and people were far more ambivalent about this than maybe your grandmother was, or people in Kerry were. But there's a degree of questioning about all of this stuff that's happening all the time. I think Francis Flanagan's work has shown that really, really well.
Got a question here in the centre, a couple on the periphery as well.
Let's take a few together.
Yeah, we'll take a few together, exactly. So, who wants to start? Yeah, you go.
I think this was in a lot of speakers' comments, that law kind of occupied a huge point in civil wars, in interstate conflict.
So the first question about the international law, you could say that in the history of warfare there is a process of domestication and regulation of warfare that begins with interstate wars, the laws of war, Hague, Geneva, and that only now is reaching civil wars, because now there are also, both through the UN, things like the responsibility to protect, but also the International Criminal Court, the court for the war in the ex-Yugoslavia. So there have been a number of processes to both sanction and then send a message for those who fight civil wars that there is no impunity. One thing also that is changing very much is our capacity to observe what is going on. So everything is much more visible than it used to be because of technology. So the way I see it is that there is a process of regulation that is now moving into civil wars, partly because these are the only wars that are being fought. We no longer fight very many interstate wars. The second question on the neutrals. Here there are two aspects of it. To go back to Thucydides, he has a very nice passage about neutrals. He says, no one wanted neutrals because they were thought as free riders. Why would you stay out and would take risks? Shouldn't be stupid. And also to force everyone to take a side so that you could actually spread the war into society. But in a sense, the same is true about interstate wars. You cannot be a neutral. You cannot say, my country is fighting a war and I'm not accepting to fight. Just remember what happened with, the Vietnam war. People had to leave the country. They were prosecuted. You cannot stay out. So neutrality, whenever the stakes are at that level, seems not to really differentiate. But of course, the process of forcing people to, and in fact, I would say it's easier in certain civil wars, especially guerrilla wars, to stay on the fence. People develop a tremendous repertoires for not committing. And if you look at Afghanistan, the peasants, for example, in Afghanistan, they've learned how to basically play both sides because they understand the cost of doing so. And there are ways in which local communities collude in order to not play that kind of game. So there are all kinds of very interesting things that happen, but they do not fall neatly on the line of civil versus interstate war. On negotiated settlements, why? There are two reasons, and what makes it very difficult is they're connected. One is international and systemic. The reason why negotiated settlements became common after the end of the Cold War is because there were no bipolar competition. So that made it easier for the UN or the United States or the international community to basically impose both through sticks and carrots these kinds of settlements, which was not possible beforehand. But at the same time, it's also about the values of the war itself. As if you are fighting a revolutionary war, it's an existential question that allows very little room for compromise because you have very distinct models and ideas for the post-war situation. So you are not going to be compromising. There is a very interesting set of tests here. For example, the civil war in El Salvador. You could argue the two sides had very strong divisions, but yet when the Cold War ends, they are forced by necessity to compromise. At the same time, it's very interesting to see now the end of the liberal consensus, because a very big part of civil wars after September 11, 2001 are taking place in Muslim-majority countries where the rebels are jihadi. And the jihadis have a very strong uncompromising vision. That's why you don't see anyone pushing for a compromise in places where they're very active. Nobody wants to govern with jihadis. And so there is part of it is the structure of ideological conflict. But then the structure of ideological conflict is also associated to the international system.
I'll just run straight through. The legal formalism is really interesting, and I just have one thing to say there. It's a famous article by Philip Paladin about why the common soldier in the North effectively decided to fight. And they said he argues it's because the soldier in the North was used to immediacy of the law, village councils, schoolhouses, a presence of the law. You might say that for the South, but at the same time, Southerners experienced very few legal structures because they were so rural. They did come to the county court once a year, things like that. So you could also argue that there was very little, maybe there was respect for rule of law, but there were very few rules of law that touched Confederates' lives before the Confederacy. As for the neutral question, they were very concerned about this.
Was there a famous case of a person taking a stand, sort of well-known personalities taking a stand and saying, I do not want to side with either the North or the South?
Not within the Confederacy. There was on the Tennessee border and sometimes on the Arkansas border, but within
not
the South,
nationally.
no, not within the Confederacy,
Or the
except
Union.
for, of course, Frederick Douglass. Slaves who had escaped, and enslaved people who kept escaping, of course, were a powerful voice about, we have to be thought about this way. But they structured recruitment. You couldn't be neutral because they drafted every man from 16 to 45, every man, and they formed companies locally. So in my family, the company has about 20 people, 25 people, and about 15 of them are my direct, relatives. And so that keeps anyone from being neutral, because if you don't go, your brother went. You have to go. You're not fighting a war, you're fighting for your family. They made it so that was what happened. And finally, Reconstruction, they had a very difficult time imposing order in the beginning. They sent federal troops to occupy the South. They set conditions with which each state could re-enter the Union, which included approving the constitutional amendments that freed slaves, made them citizens, and gave them the right to vote. But basically, the North quickly lost its appetite for enforcing these things because the primary reason they were fighting was to preserve the Union and for the opportunity for free soil, and not for outcome of equality, not to free the slaves and not for outcome of equality. So 10 years out, there is no cause there for the North except for religious abolitionists to continue. It's a great book on that by Steve Kantrowitz. Just down.
Great. On the rule of law, there's some really interesting stuff. It's back to Cormac's point about maybe the use of imprisonment and the use of executions. And again, there's legal frameworks put in place in some respects, but what you have in private are often very different statements or very different defences of some of these actions in private. And I think one springs to mind, Desmond Fitzgerald is defending the execution of Erskine Childers, not on the basis that he's arguing that, you could say he was a good fellow and he was this, that, and the other, and what we did was illegal. But basically, we have to do this in order to protect, or effectively the state will not survive if we do not do this. and that all or nothing type of argument, which gets blurred into sort of, in some senses, legal formula. But I think it's more striking as it goes on. You get this very open equation of political opposition with criminality, and a blurring of criminality means political opposition, which you can see still working itself out in some of the justice material into the early 20s. That potentially is just ordinary decent crime is becoming conflated with something that's much more serious as a threat to the state itself, and the very quick recourse to kind of emergency measures as time goes on. But again, I think in some ways the public-private thing, the room for neutrals, I think, is fascinating in many, many respects. And I think in some ways it relates to who we've looked for in terms of how we've told the history of this period. And it's back to Eunan's point about elites, because in some ways we're listening to a lot of military elites who have effectively a lot of skin in the game, that this remains discussed in the context of how violent it was and how important militarily it was. But I think that your point about emotional violence is very useful, particularly when you look here at the way the Catholic Church becomes involved and the use to some extent that's made of the Catholic Church. But equally then you see W.T. Cosgrave very quickly writing to local parish priests, local doctors, local, as they see it, pillars of the community who can in some way influence people to adhere to the rule of law. And I think there's a huge amount of people largely just trying to get on with things. But equally what's interesting in terms of, back to Cormac's first point, is the extent to which a lot of people seem not to be raising their voices about issues of imprisonment, or particularly executions, again linked to questions of censorship. But in a way, these are politicians here who are doing a lot of this stuff, are people, as William probably knows better than anybody in the room, these are people who've cut their political teeth on being prisoners and getting people out of prison and executions after the Easter Rising, but they are very effective at using these things as tools to quieten everything down. So there's a whole host of things going on, but again, it's clearly linked to who we're actually choosing to hear in this. And to some degree yet, we're not really choosing to hear or to listen to or to find even the people who are just trying to get along with things while all of this is going on around them. Sorry, again, rambling.
Yeah, no, I really thought the question about neutrality is an interesting one, because I can't immediately think of a case where neutrality is possible in the Civil War context. I can think of one where neutrality is possible in interstate wars. I mean, think of Switzerland, of course, a heavily armed neutrality. So we're sitting up there, highest per capita density of privately
But
owned
within
firearms.
states, a state that is fighting a war.
Well, if you conceptualize the kind of that part of the Second World War as something that is both an interstate war, but also, of course, a European Civil War, which is fought by particular interest groups, communists, National Socialist, fascist sympathizers in different communities. So if you think of it as a bit of both, then the resilience of Switzerland is quite an interesting case study, as opposed to, say, the Netherlands in the Second World War. But in the Civil War context, are there examples of armed neutrality, where people are worried about involving certain communities because there is a certain risk of...
Yeah, there is a lot of literature on so-called communities of peace in places like Colombia, mostly indigenous communities that get together and fight against both sides. But it's a very limited phenomenon, though. But that's the best I know of.
I should have answered the question about, do I know of any neutrals, differently. Pro-slavery ideology became so virulent from 1845 to 1860 that all the people who were neutral, I grew up in a Quaker community, I'm not Quaker, they left the South. Anybody who was an elite white slaveholder who just didn't want to be involved would have left as well. So they're drummed out of the South, they're drummed out of the church. Ministers, the Protestant denominations secede and become Southern, and then they're Northern Methodists and Southern Methodists, so you couldn't stay.
But what about the North?
Oh, well, the free...
Were the voices in the
Neutral.
North to say, we don't want to fight against the South? That's not our war.
Not for ideological reasons that I can find other than pacifist. No, probably not.
Okay, we have time for one more round of questions. A couple of them. Yeah, Frank, you want to start?
Just very briefly, there was a neutral
I can only go back to my original position that being clear-eyed about what happened, taking in all of the newest ways that we do history. It was very difficult in the United States to get histories of common people because elites made the archives, etc. Has to be the best policy, has to be the best policy in the schools. I think the entire world has been troubled by what you describe. And some people are having trouble wondering, examining their own sort of heartfelt ideas about evil and what makes people turn to that kind of, we're tired of being told how bad we are. Yet, I'm sure our political scientists can't. I mean, what do you make of this? You know so much more about that.
Of what?
Of the rise of the right in Germany. And
Well, you know, it's impossible to
Too
say,
much
but
history.
I can tell you, imagine a situation in which there wasn't so much investment in history in Germany after the war. Perhaps the outcome would have been much worse.
yeah.
And also the other side of it is that everything is very dynamic in life. That is, something works up to a level, and then up to a certain level, then it may cause a backlash. There's a very big debate among statisticians in political science about whether repression causes dissent and dissent causes repression. It's impossible to solve because these two things are so intertwined and they can work in any different direction, and very small changes can have very big effects.
It's like a depressing job.
Yes. There are like hundreds of papers on that question, trying to say, well, you know, the more you repress, the more you create opposition, or the opposite, and it's never ending.
So,
I was very interested in the framework you suggested with your four traditions. I don't know if we could maybe get that slide up here. So I can
put that to sleep, eh? Which one?
three or,
Absolutely.
or all four categories.
Because these are not meant to be mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
They are
Okay.
just different types of understanding, and of course there's a lot of overlap.
And my second point then is kind of also for the rest of the panel is how likely are we to see themes like this, or themes emerge dependent on the length of the conflict? So the role that's played by how long conflict is fought for. The Irish Civil War very short, American Civil War somewhere in the middle, and now we look at say Syria, which has
Syria is considered a short conflict because it's basically over. It took 7 years, which is short for civil wars by the standards of civil wars. And actually, there is a very interesting correlation, which is inverse. There is the long civil wars that go on for 40, 50 years. The wars of Myanmar, for example, tend to be very low intensity because obviously you cannot fight very intensively for all those years. So there is usually short civil wars tend to be much more intense.
All right. Thank you all very much for your contributions, for the questions that you asked, for being so engaged. I found this very enjoyable, despite the depressing topic.
To go back to Anne's points, I think civil wars are very depressing and violence is very depressing, but at the same time, there's a set of deeply fascinating issues about civil wars that attracts us to study them, both at the level of human behavior, but also at the level of the civil wars shape the world in which we live in a very direct way. And that explains why we study them, to go back to Anne's points.
I couldn't have put it better. Stathis. We'll continue our discussion informally, as usual, in the common room, so if you want to join us for a refreshment, please do. Thank you.